Hey guys, welcome to Unmatched Philosophy. My name is Braylon Samuel, and today I am joined with Dr. Graham Oppy. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name's Graham Oppy. Unless there's you want me to say more. But
Yeah, okay, that's fine. So my first question that I want to ask is, uh, recently you've been defending this kind of view, at least in the popular sphere. People have been seeing you defend this kind of view called metaphysical naturalism. What is metaphysical naturalism?
okay, so naturalism means lots of different things in philosophy. What I've got in mind is a view about the extent of causal reality. So I think that there's a causal domain, and I think that that domain is coextensive with natural reality. That's why it's the same domain. The causal domain and the natural domain are the same, so that there are no causes other than natural causes. So that's half of the view. Uh, the other half of the view is how we um, identify what causes there are. And there, according to me, the kind of touchstone is science, where science is not just natural science, but it includes human sciences and some other stuff as well. So, what gets excluded on this naturalist picture um, is God, gods, um, ghosts, and a whole lot of other stuff. If there isn't, um, you know, a if these things don't feature in the explanations that we give in natural science or social science, then according to me, they don't exist, roughly.
Would you say that souls are excluded as well?
Uh, so it depends what kind of view you take about souls. If you think of them as immaterial, then yes, they're excluded. If you just want to say that, you know, animals and people um, count as having souls just because they're living and they have brains that operate in certain kinds of ways, then maybe we can make sense of talk about souls that way. But if you're thinking of souls as things that are capable of independent existence, perhaps in some immaterials or non-natural sphere, then no, they get ruled out from the definition. Yeah.
And so, what is your motivation behind taking this kind of view? Like, what made you become or accept this form of metaphysical naturalism rather than any other view that would allow the existence of souls or the existence of God or ghosts or whatever?
So um, I think that it's a kind of so one of its attractions is that it's a kind of minimal position. It seems to me that everybody should accept that there's a natural domain. There are people and cars and electrons and all kinds of stuff, right? There's a universe. And the question is there any reason to think that there's more? Is there stuff beyond what belongs to the natural universe? And I think the answer to that question is no, unsurprisingly. So, what's attractive about this view is that it's kind of the minimal view that you need. You postulate enough stuff to explain everything that needs explaining, and you don't add to it. Right. I mean, you could add to it in ever so many ways, and people do, and then they argue with one another about the extra things that they've added. But typically, people don't argue about, whether there's money or whether there are dogs and so on. The natural stuff is sort of common ground. So that's what's attractive about the view. Notice, I should say that this isn't a view about necessarily a view about everything. It's a view about the causal domain. It leaves open the question, for example, what numbers are, right? But when you ask me about souls, I assume that you were thinking of souls as having agency, right?
Yeah.
So that's what rules them out.
Okay, and so you were saying that if you just pause, you could posit the universe and posit the like not natural reality, um, as exhausting causal reality, and you think that that explains everything. So, what do you think explains the existence of the universe and the stuff that we see? So, like the money and all that.
Right. So um, I think that there are kind of various ways that you might think about this. I mean, just think about causal reality. Forget about naturalism for now and just accept that there's a causal domain. What explains its existence? Why is there a causal domain? There are not many options, right? One option is that there's a causal domain because there always has been. There's a kind of infinite regress. So every bit of the causal domain gets explained by an earlier bit of the causal domain. There's no beginning, and that's just kind of the full story. That's one way you might go. Another way you might go is you might say, well, if there isn't an infinite regress, there's a beginning. There's no explaining the beginning. The beginning just is a kind of a brute thing, something without explanation. Or you might say there's a beginning and the beginning isn't brute. But what kind of explanation can it have if it's the beginning? It can't have a causal explanation. The only kind of explanation that seems plausible to me is that it's necessary. It had to be that way. That explains why it happened. Couldn't have been otherwise. So that gives you three um, explanations that you might have. Some people have thought maybe there's a fourth one, that there's the beginning because it's good that there's the beginning. I'm not inclined to see that as a candidate for explaining why there's a universe, right? That just doesn't grab me as an explanation. So we've got these three. I'm inclined to think they're all live. People take them seriously. You might happen on one or another of them. If you're a certain kind of theist, you're going to think, okay, this causal stuff begins with God and God exists of necessity. But if you're a naturalist, you can think, well, there's this initial spot and in this initial state of the universe, it's necessary. It couldn't have been otherwise. And that's what explains everything else. As far as I can see, whichever way we go, whether a theist could equally think there's God and there's no explanation for God, or the naturalist can say, well, there's the initial state of the universe and there's no explanation for that. Whichever way we go, it looks as though the theist and the naturalist are going to be, will have essentially the same options for explaining causal reality. There's not going to be an advantage that goes one way or the other. Right, that's how I see it.
Right. Um, so is it the case that you prefer the view which says that the initial state was metaphysically necessary? And if so, if you do prefer that view,
Yeah,
why do you prefer that view instead of there being an infinite
yeah.
regress?
So like if you put my toes to the fire and say choose, I'm going to choose necessity. I'm not sure how confident I am about this, and I'll try to explain why. The view of modality, metaphysical modality, that I like is one that says, all worlds begin, they share history with the actual world, and they depart from it because indeterministic causation plays out differently. Indeterministic causation could be free choices, or it could be sort of at the quantum level. I mean, I'm not worried about the details. I'm inclined to think that there's indeterminism at the quantum level, right? So every world, I mean, if you've got this picture of the possible worlds that they all share a common history of some sort, then that may automatically it falls out that the origin is necessary because it's shared by all the worlds, and being shared by all the worlds is just what being necessary is. Um, Lots of people don't like this picture of sort of modality. What it gives you is quite a limited range of possibilities. All the possibilities that there are have to be generated from past history of the actual world with indeterministic chances playing out differently. Lots of people prefer a picture where the possibilities, essentially anything that you can consistently conceive, is a possibility. And so you have a much wider range of possibilities, and a much smaller range, in some sense, of necessities. Um, I inclined to think that we shouldn't multiply possibilities beyond those we really need. And so I prefer the picture, the actualist picture that I've sketched. As I said, I'm not sure how confident I should be about any of that, right? But if you say I must choose, that's my view, right?
So, I mean, I've always had this question when I heard you say that before. Um, why wouldn't we think that possible entities or possibilities should be taken as like ontological free lunch? So why wouldn't we think that if you posit a lot of entities or a limited amount of entities, it's just like it really doesn't make a difference because the things in which do actually exist are still going to be perhaps the same.
So the idea here is that modality ends up being kind of a feature of um, the actual world, right? So if you think of when you've got indeterministic causation, you've got something and it has the kind of power to play out in a bunch of different ways. So the possibilities are not free lunch at all. All the possibilities are doing work, real metaphysical work, right? When you say, well, that the atom decayed at this point, but it didn't have to. It could have decayed earlier or later, so long as it was kind of left alone, right? All of the possibility that you're postulating there, all of the causal power that you're postulating there is doing real work in your ontology, right? So I don't see any value in postulating but the way that you're thinking about it, these kind of free floating possibilities that have got nothing to do with the operation of the actual world, right? Because you don't need them, right? They're not, as you said, they're not doing any work. So, you know, why
That's
bother
fair.
with them?
Yeah, that's fair. Okay, so let's talk about atheism a little bit more. So you seemed, like you said earlier, that your view rules out theism. Um, but do you think that there's any good arguments for theism or atheism, independent of perhaps the consideration concerning simplicity?
Um, okay, so let me say something about the last bit, the qualification there, right? It's the way that I think about theory choice, and I'm thinking of this now as an exercise in theory choice. We have a theistic theory and a naturalistic theory, and we want to know which one's better. It's not that we should just pick the simpler theory. What we should do, we need some understanding of what the relevant data is, what needs to be explained. And then we should pick the theory that makes the best trade off between minimizing our commitments and maximizing explanation. That won't necessarily be a theory, the simplest theory, because the simplest theory presumably is the one that says that there's nothing. It just does woefully badly at explaining. And it won't be the one that maximizes explanation either, because there's lots of sort of mere coincidences that don't require explanation. If you want an explanation for everything, right, you'll end up with a hideously complicated theory, so there's a sweet spot somewhere in between, making the best of that choice. Okay, so that's just kind of explaining what the kind of underlying idea about how we're going to make the choice between the two theories goes. And you mentioned when we were discussing before we came on that you've read both Mackey and Swinburne. Essentially, they both use this method. This is just a kind of Bayesian. I mean, you can translate this into Bayesian terminology. It's just picking the theory with the highest posterior probability, right? Because you think of the prior as measuring simplicity, and then when you're comparing the likelihoods, you're looking for the one that explains the most data because you're asking how probable is the data on the theory, right? And then you put those two things together and out pops the posterior probability, right? So for kind of technical reasons, I'm not inclined to be a Bayesian, but the method's basically the same. Okay. So in the dispute between Mackey and Swinburne, I'm on Mackey's side. I think that the kind of posterior probability for naturalism's higher than the posterior probability for theism. And I think that, first of all, naturalism's simpler, so it wins on prior probability. And I think that there's nowhere where the likelihood of theism on the evidence is higher, right? So what I've always done is just argue for a draw. Swinburne argues for simplicity favouring theism, and then argues that, at least in a lot of cases, theism is more probable on the evidence as well. And I take it that Mackey essentially argues what I'm arguing: naturalism simpler, and there isn't anywhere, or at any rate, there are only a few cases, and not the most important ones, where theism gives a better explanation. So that's kind of the nature of the debate, and why I end up where I do.
And I don't know if I've ever heard you speak about this, but would you say that the problem of evil, do you think that affects like how you view atheism? Like, do you think that or theism, do you think that like plays into the debate in a significant way for you?
So when I discussed, so you actually started asking about arguments, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think that there are any successful arguments on either side. I think that, rational people can reasonably just disagree in their verdicts on this question. But in the best argument against God, when I sort of think about setting out an argument that looks a lot like Swinburne's argument, except that it's an argument for naturalism as opposed to an argument for theism, I spend a bit of time talking about evil. I think that the right way to divide up the data is that there's going to be, you don't just consider the evils on their own, you consider the goods and the evils all together. And you want to know, okay, so what explains the kind of total distribution of value in the world the best? Now, you might think that the distribution of evils on its own, if you just considered that on its own, would somehow or other favour naturalism over theism. So Paul Draper, for example, has a really long, complicated, quite nice argument to that effect. I'm not worried about forming a judgment of that kind about that. And I should say, and his data isn't just about evil, it's about the goods and evils and their balance. I'm quite happy to leave it as an open question whether Paul's right about that, because my overall argument, all I want is that that data doesn't favour theism over naturalism, and many people have thought that that's right, including many theists. Right, lots of theists think if there is a kind of serious objection to their view, it comes from evil. So they're thinking that there's at least a kind of pretty strong prima facie reason to think that evil is a problem for at least the kind of theism that postulates an omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good sole creator of all else. Yeah.
Okay, so what would you say concerning more of a pantheistic approach? So there's going to be some people who think roughly something like nature is God, or that the universe is God, or something of that sort. I'm not really sure how they would sketch it out. And then they might be able to make the same claim that the universe is necessary, and perhaps some additional claims concerning like if the universe is divine or stuff of that sort. What would you say concerning that kind of view?
So I have a paper that I wrote a long time ago, back in the 90s, on this topic. And although I hadn't kind of elaborated the full theoretical framework that I've been using more recently, it's kind of clear what I'm going to say. If you're the kind of pantheist that you've just described, and you're not the kind who thinks that there's a kind of universal mind or something that's co-located with the universe, you think that there's just the universe, but it has the additional property of being divine, then that's an extra property that I see no reason to postulate. And so I'm just going to say, no, your view's more complicated and it's not getting us anything. Right.
Okay, I guess that's a fair objection. Um, okay, so let's talk a little bit about the stuff concerning like the soul. So a lot of people have the thought that when you're speaking of like intentions, you're speaking of thoughts, you're speaking of what it is for us to be us. that there is got to be some additional there's got to be some additional entity. Perhaps you'd have a soul and you'd have a body. Or some other people might take a property dualistic account. So we might think that there is going to be like the physical brain, and it has like it for some like in some way divides into having to do two properties, one being a physical and non-physical or something of that sort. So what is your thought concerning that?
So obviously, I think that given the way I described my view, that the properties of the brain are all natural properties. It's just that I think that Jack Smart was right way back when he wrote Sensations and Brain Processes. For creatures like us, for some of the states that we can be in, there's something that it's like for us to be in those states. Right. And so we have this vocabulary. We talk about how things seem and feel and so on. What it turns out that we're talking about is just kind of natural states of an organism. That's, I mean, in very short, that's the view that I prefer.
And do you think that there's going to be like do you think that any of the so you were kind of referring to like the state of like what it's like to be in what it's like to be in a specific state, and I was
Yeah.
just kind of curious, like, do you think that like any arguments such as like the Mary's room argument is going to be successful against the identity theory? It seems that that's what you're accepting, and why
Yeah.
not?
So, so there's a bunch of arguments, right? The um, the black and white room is one, but Chalmers' zombie argument is another. So I'll start with the zombie argument. I just think it's impossible for there to be something that's configured as I am and that there's nothing that it's like to be configured that way. It's not like there's something here that can be peeled away in some weird, distant, possible world where the laws are different and so on. Right? I don't think there are such worlds. Right? I mean, we sort of established that when we were going through the discussion of the theory of modality. Right? So I just think that zombies are impossible. Um, the Jackson's argument is kind of more complicated, I think. What I think is going on it kind of depends upon what abilities we imagine our super neuroscientist Mary has. So if she has the right kind of control over her mental states, maybe she can put herself into a state where she experiences what it's like to see red, even though there are no red objects in her vicinity. That seems unlikely. But then what will be true of her is that she's never been in a state before she leaves the room where she of the kind, there's something that it's like to be in this state that enables you to judge the colors of things merely by looking at them without bringing any prior theory to bear. Because she's effectively omniscient, she knows what the colors of everything in the room are. Right. The only thing so it's not like when she leaves the room, suddenly she discovers what the colors of things are. She knows all that already because we've supposed that she's physically omniscient. What happens is that there's an ability that she's never exercised that she gets to exercise for the first time, which is this ability to judge the colors of things just by looking at them. Right. Something like that is what I think is the right story to tell.
And what were you going to say concerning Chalmers' zombie argument?
So I just want to say that zombies are impossible, right? The argument turns on the idea that it's possible,
Mm-hmm.
that there could be something that was just like me, but the lights were off, there was nothing going
Oh,
on.
that's what you
Right.
started with.
Yeah, that's what I started with.
Oh,
And
okay.
if you accept Smart's view, then there's no hiving off there being something that it's like to be in this state from the state. Right.
Right. So, um, I guess I have this kind of I have this other question that is a little bit interesting because I've heard you talk about this before. I've heard you say like, well, I'd let you say it here. So, what do you think? Um, what do you think explains perhaps a lot of people use the term like the fine tuning of the universe. So, because you've said that the universe, the initial state is necessary. So at least we'd have the initial history of the universe being necessary. Is it the case that you think that the values like in which the universe are going to have is going to be set in the beginning of the universe, and that's also going to be metaphysically necessary?
I don't have a view about whether the values are set at the initial state or not. So there's a kind of two-part argument here because either they are or they aren't.
Okay.
If they are, they're necessary, right?
Mm-hmm.
That just comes for free with the view. Suppose they're not, so they're not fixed. Then I think the right answer is so what that will mean is that at some point chances play out in a way that fixes the values. They weren't fixed and then they do become fixed as a result of a chance process. In that case, there's a very big range of possible worlds, right? And it's just, you just have to accept that in all the worlds, something unlikely happened. You got a particular outcome, right? The values could be any of this wide range of possibilities, and they settled into one. It just so happens that our world is one where they settled into the the life permitting range, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, it's not clear whether we should think that the fine tuning's for life or for stars or for beetles or what, but whatever.
Okay, and that's interesting. And I assume the thought that you'd have is that so somebody else might come in and say, well, it seems like the fine tuning will be like at least would be if you say no, of course, that the values
Yeah.
set are not metaphysically necessary. Somebody might say, oh, well, it seems like it's a better explanation could be provided would be theism. And you would say, perhaps no, it's already ruled out, given that the initial state at least itself was metaphysically necessary. So then we wouldn't have any need for God, at least in the postulation of the universe. And then the way that we get the value set is just going to be they're going to be like indeterministic causation is going to play out in various ways, or
So I'm going to take a slightly different route. So I'm going to think about it like this. We've if we suppose that there's God, right, we can still ask the question, at what point and in what way did God determine what these values were going to be? Right. Now, one way can be he's just set up from the beginning to make a universe with those values, right? And that's just equivalent to them being fixed at the beginning, right? So this idea, we have a different view about what the causal sequence is, but we still have this same question about where the values are fixed. If they're fixed from the beginning, then it's just necessary, right? And that's the same explanation whether they're a theist or a naturalist. Suppose they get fixed at a later point, right? And we're thinking there's this vast range of possible worlds, right? And God can choose any of those values, so there's some possible world where God does make the choice, right? Most of those worlds are going to be ones where there's no life, right? And there's nothing. We're supposing they're possibilities, right? They're not ruled out. So it looks as though in this case, the theist is in the same position as the naturalist again. You just accept there's this very unlikely outcome and it happened. Right. So
okay,
it seems to me you get no advantage either way, right?
okay. Yeah, so even when you're like considering the cumulative case of like Swinburne, even though he includes that as something that favors theism, you're going to say no because you'd basically be in the same situation as the naturalist.
Yeah, so I'm going to say it's a draw, right? Both views um, have exactly the same kind of explanation once we divide the case up into always or fixed at some later point where there's a transition from its not being fixed to its being fixed, right?
Um.
Which
Oh,
which looks like it's got to be um, indeterministic in both cases. I mean, it can't be that when God's there on God's own and makes this transition from not fixed to fixed, that there's something else that's causing it to happen. So it looks like it's got to be indeterministic. Right. That's
and So when I was kind of like looking at some of the literature in philosophy of religion, you see this like argument from Plantinga called like I think it's called like the evolutionary argument for against naturalism or something of that sort, where it seems like if you're uh, roughly something like this, if you're a naturalist, it's probably you're probably not going to be able to accept evolution, because if you think that all of our beliefs and everything of that sort is just going to be derivative of evolutionary processes, it's not going to be the case that they're going to be perhaps truth tracking or at least conducive to the truth. And then so, that's going to be very problematic if you want to accept both. And so I just want to know what your thoughts are concerning that kind of argument.
Okay, so let's start with the definition. Say that our sort of faculties are reliable just in case they mostly produce the truth as outcome, right? So our belief forming mechanisms are reliable just so long as they mostly give us the truth. And what Plantinga wants to argue is that naturalists are going to be committed either to the claim that the probability that our belief forming faculties are reliable given evolution and naturalism, given the conjunct of the two, is very low, in which case that's supposed to be a problem, or at least that when it comes to metaphysics, right? So it's not just our sort of metaphysics belief formers, the probability that they're reliable is very low given naturalism and evolution. So given, I'll call it naturalistic, evolutionary naturalism. So now it kind of matters, right? These two cases are different because what seems right to me is two things. First, that on evolutionary naturalism, as on any reasonable view, the probability that we're good at metaphysics is zero. And the way that you infer that is just by looking at all the disagreement, right? Pick any metaphysical claim and most people reject it, right? Or maybe sometimes you get 50% or, maybe a bit higher. But there's no claims where we're clearly converging on the truth. And if you look at the history of metaphysical belief, it goes all over the place. It's not just metaphysics, it's philosophy generally and religion and politics. There's a bunch of areas where we're clearly just terrible at getting at the truth. Right? So if that was a problem, it would be everybody's problem, right? It's not like theists have a golden link to the truth in metaphysics or politics or religion or whatever. On the other hand, if we're just talking about our ordinary perceptual believing, right, my ability to look out the window and see there's a cat in the backyard, right, we're good at that, and evolutionary naturalism has a really great explanation of why we're good at that, right? Our perceptual capacities were honed over an incredibly long period of time in ways that really require that we end up being quite good at detecting predators, food, and so on, right? So there are reasons why our visual, auditory faculties and so on are highly reliable and deliver us the truth about our environment, right? And so on that score, once you focus in on that, Plantinga's assessment of the reliability, of the relevant likelihood, the likelihood of our being reliable given evolution and evolutionary naturalism, he just makes the wrong assessment of that. Right. So it's slightly complicated because he runs these two arguments, one after the other, and what to say about them is very different. Right.
Okay. And so to be clear for the audience watching, so I'm really in this interview, I really just want to unpack naturalism. Like I just want to see what if somebody were to have similar views to Graham Oppy, what they would sound like and what it would be like. And so there's this other question that I've been wanting to ask, which is within conversations concerning grounding, there's been this debate aside from the actual notion of grounding. There's been this debate between what some people might call priority monists and priority pluralists, where priority monists like Jonathan Schaffer, most notably, he might say something like that the soul substance is going to be the universe, and then so what's going to be fundamental is the universe, and then we're going to have like priority pluralists who might say that what's going to be fundamental might be like atoms, molecules, particles, or something of that sort. Do you which one would you say that you lean towards if you had to pick a side?
So I actually don't lean towards either of
Okay.
those positions. Um, so I'm kind of skeptical about the idea that there's a fundamental um, level in metaphysics, whether you think that it's the biggest level or the smallest level or something else. In fact, I'm kind of skeptical that the world has levels at all. Now, this is something that I've been playing with recently, and so it may sound kind of wacky, I think, and I'm still trying to sort of think my way through this. I think that the universe clearly um, it exists at different scales, right? So you can think about what things look like on the scale of a meter or 10 to the minus 3 meters or 10 to the minus 6 meters. And they're kind of characteristic things, or at the scale of a billion kilometers or whatever. And so at different scales, there are things that you can see exist at that scale that aren't visible at the bigger scales or the lower scales. So if you're thinking about galactic clusters, that scale, whatever it is, 10 to the 18 meters or whatever, I don't know, some enormous amount, right? You can't, people aren't visible on that scale, and nor are molecules. If you think about a much smaller scale, like 10 to the minus 15 or something like that, some really tiny scale, it's not clear exactly what you see. Quarks or, maybe electrons or something, they'll be what you see at that scale. And if you think about the evolution of the universe over time, so think of the evolution of state of the universe over time, there's a kind of consistency in the evolution. So if we think about what's happening to my arm and its particles over time, barring an awful sort of accident, the particles go where the arm goes and the arm goes where the particle goes. It's not clear that we should think that there's a priority one way or the other, right? So, um, so that's the thought, right? So if you have that sort of thought, you're not going to take sides in the dispute over you know, priority monism versus priority pluralism.
Okay, and so what is the reason for I guess rejecting the notion of like levels and accepting something saying that like perhaps there's going to be different things that exist on different scales?
So this is an interesting question. One thing you might worry about is that this is a kind of needless complexity in the view. It feels like it would be simpler if we could say that everything was determined at a particular level. I mean, so that you could just kind of infer what happens at all the other scales from what happens at a particular scale. If you think that there's a lower scale, you think stuff's going on down there, and that's determining completely what happens at higher scales. I think that that kind of micro to macro determinism is a kind of disturbing view, right? And one thing that uh, it seems that view challenges is sort of our sense of agency, right? It seems to me that I do various things, but on that view, all that's happening is there's a bunch of particles moving at some very low level, that just adds up to my moving around in a certain kind of way, right? So I think that's a reason for not liking the kind of micro to macro. The macro to micro actually suffers from exactly the same problem, right? The universe at this top scale is doing something, and that just determines what I do, right? In a way that kind of seems to really threaten agency. And so, one of the reasons why I think this view might potentially be attractive is because you can take seriously data about agency and then accommodate it in the view, right? So if you think of there being data about agency, then you might be attracted to it.
Okay. Um, and so I don't know. I mean, perhaps I might be getting this wrong. So when you're referring like when you're using this term like agency, are you referring to something like free will, or like when you mean agency, what is it? What do you mean by that?
So that the it is something like freedom, but it's not. It's the way that debates about freedom have gone over the last 20 years or so, 20 30 years. People have moved away from the kind of libertarian conception, the kind of freedom to do otherwise in the circumstances, and moved towards the kind of source conception. You know, you're the source of your actions, which means I think that on our scale, right, the source of our actions sits on the scale at which we exist. So the source of our action can't be the particles, and it can't be the universe as a whole, right? So so you might think of it as freedom, but it's a particular conception of freedom. It's not one that's tied to the you could have done otherwise in the circumstances.
Okay, okay, that makes a lot of sense. Um, and so I also wanted to ask you this question concerning the principle of sufficient reason. So you do think that there is going to be something that's necessary, which is going to be the initial state. Um, so does that mean that you accept like perhaps a restricted form of the PSR, or
So what I think is that when you have indeterministic causation, there's something that has no explanation. So suppose that we've got something that can go two ways. You can either get A or you can get B. Suppose you get B, right, but it's indeterministic. Then there's no explaining this fact that you got B and not A, that you got B rather than A, right? So there'll be things that have no explanation on I think on any view on which you allow that there's indeterminism. The principle of sufficient reason that I like will be one that allows for that much
okay,
absence of explanation and no more, right? So where you've got indeterminism, you end up with these contrastive facts that are unexplained, right? But everything else has an explanation, because for everything else, either it's got a kind of deterministic cause or it's necessary, right?
right? So your kind of thought is like perhaps when we think of like somebody making a claim that if you have all these contingent facts, every single contingent fact needs an explanation. Well, that might not be true because whether if you have indeterministic causation, having B rather than A, that might be that's a contingent fact, but that is not going to have an explanation. Perhaps any view.
Yeah,
Um,
that's correct. So the very strong versions of the principle of sufficient reason will be ruled out, but there's this weaker one, right, which says everything has an explanation except for this one case, right?
mm-hmm. um, and so I actually I have thoughts concerning this. So if you have the thought that there is going to be a lot of contingent facts in which call out for an explanation, but this one you suggest that you can't provide an explanation for it. Um, why should we think that like we need? I mean, I know this is. Why should we think that this is the only thing? I guess that's the best question. It's like
Right.
why think that this is the only
Yeah.
thing?
So I might be wrong. There might be other cases, right? But um, if I mean, supposing that there isn't, I can tell you what the principle of sufficient reason looks like.
Mm-hmm.
If there were other cases, then it would be kind of everything has an explanation except, and then there'd be a list of more cases. I prefer a view where there's fewer exceptions, right? And so I'm not going to kind of multiply my list unless I need to, right? And I can't think of, or at least so far, I haven't thought of other cases where I want an exception. I think it's 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 quite tricky because it's very hard to know exactly what isn't determined in the actual world, because you can have a kind of amplification of indeterminism from a lower scale to a higher one. Get yourself a Geiger counter and assume that it's what it's detecting is these indeterministic events in the background, and you can use it as a quantum coin. Now I can go for a walk, and each time I come to a corner, I toss my quantum coin. Right at the beginning of my walk, nobody could predict, not even God could predict where I was going, right? Because it's indeterministic. You have to wait until these chance processes happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, so there can be, there. I mean, there are people like Penrose speculated about the idea that effectively we kind of got quantum coins in our brain, and that's the source of our libertarian freedom, because our behaviour is being driven partly by this kind of keying into quantum indeterminacy. I'm not suggesting that that's right. It might be that effectively, largely, our brains are kind of deterministic mechanisms that would be possible. But I don't know, right? I'm just assuming there's some indeterminism, probably at the quantum level, but there might be more.
Okay, so I wanted to actually ask you this question. So you seem to think, I remember you were saying before that when you consider like the various arguments for theism, you're gonna think that those arguments, when you consider theism against like your form of naturalism, there's generally speaking a tie. So what if you're somebody perhaps like William Lane Craig, who thinks that there are going to be moral facts, and the moral facts for their existence depend upon God, and in your obviously in your view, there's not going to be such a God, and so by his lights, there wouldn't be any moral facts, but clearly there are moral facts. What would you say about that? Because it seems like there really could not be a tie unless you try to find an alternative to how we could capture moral facts.
So there's going to be a question about whether we should or we shouldn't think that there being moral facts is part of the data that needs explaining or not. And there are lots of naturalists who are not moral realists. There are lots of naturalists who are error theorists or certain kinds of
Non-cognitivists.
non-cognitivists and so on, right? And so I think that when we're doing the theory choice, you have to take those positions seriously. Now, I'm inclined, I mean, and this is super controversial, I'm inclined to think that we should think of morality in the way that we should think of mathematics. So we should think that there are kind of some basic necessary truths, right? And in the case of mathematics, maybe there's quite a lot of independent basic um, necessary truths, but you get all the rest of the truths of mathematics from them just by logical consequence. And I think that something like that could be true for morality as well, where there's quite a lot of basic moral truths, and then we kind of get consequences by um, logical consequence from those. And importantly, I think you don't need any ontology for this, right? Once you've got necessary things, you don't need an ontology for them because they're just true no matter what. And so, in that respect, my view is when it comes to abstract objects, is quite similar to Craig's. Right? He doesn't like abstract objects because he thinks that they threaten divine aseity. I don't like abstract objects because I would rather not have them, right? If I could avoid them, but I don't know whether I can, right? And this is another kind of ongoing bit of speculation, really.
Mm-hmm. So I actually wanted to ask you a question about that a little bit, since you were just talking about like necessary mathematical and moral facts. Like, it's hard to picture. So when on one hand, I could think of like a moral truth being like, so for example, like murdering a cat is wrong. I could think of that as being true where like there is a moral property that is instantiated, but the moral property itself is necessary, perhaps like as an abstracta. And but you say you think that there could be like basic moral truths in which are necessary without there being such abstracta. How is that the case?
So, so a kind of model would be mathematics, where some people have thought you can have objectivity without objects. So it's true that 2 and 2 are 4, but there are no numbers. There's no truth makers for that claim. It's just a necessary truth, right? So that's the idea, and then you say the same thing in the moral case. So I'm thinking, though maybe this won't work, that it's a necessary truth that you shouldn't kill, and then brackets, except in a few select cases where you're allowed to.
Okay.
And we may disagree a bit about the select cases, but the core idea that you shouldn't kill is one that's common to kind of humanity. I think nobody lives in a community where everybody thinks, family, friends, they're fair game, knock them off if you want to, right? There's never been a culture like that, right? And so it's not completely implausible that there's a necessary truth in the vicinity.
And and of course you think that this doesn't add to your ontology because it's not ontologically committing.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. And so I I wonder if like I wonder when you talk about like the basic moral truths. I don't want to get too hung up on this, but I am just curious. So when you talk about like the basic moral truths, would you have like perhaps like some axioms or something like that, and you have like a set, or would you think of like for each individual case in which you make a moral statement, you're getting at something which is a necessary truth? Like so, for example, if I say like I don't know, it's wrong to. I'm trying to think of something which is like pretty controversial, like something that we have very
Yeah,
highly skeptical of it being
yeah,
even like there being a fact about the matter. So
yeah. So I mean, I agree that this is a worry. Um, I think that it's possible that under pressure, I would kind of think, okay, maybe I shouldn't be a moral realist at all. But if I'm going to be a moral realist, this is the route that I'm going to. This is the route that I'm going to take. And what I want to claim is the the problems that surface where we're kind of unsure are just because it's difficult. I mean, it's difficult first of all to actually work out what the basic moral truths are, just as it's turned out to be really quite difficult to identify all of the basic mathematical truths. I mean, it's a very slow, laborious process, and if Gödel's right, never completable either, right? Um, and if there's really an analogy between the mathematical case and the moral case, it could turn out that the moral case is a bit similar to that, right? That there's actually a lot of independent moral principles and that we haven't fully elaborated all of the true principles yet. And that the kind of thing that I gestured at, the idea that it's wrong to kill except when we're allowed to, actually will kind of be better formulated as there's a certain set of circumstances in which it's wrong to kill, right? And that will be the basic principle, not the way that I formulated it as, well, you're not allowed to kill except, right? But we certainly aren't. I don't think anybody's able to articulate exactly when we're allowed to kill in a way that's uncontroversial. And in fact, it's massively controversial. I mean, I'm going to be happy to say I think that sometimes it's okay to kill in self-defense. Sometimes it's okay to kill to defend your family. Maybe sometimes it's okay to kill if you're fighting a defensive war. Maybe sometimes it's okay to kill to defend your property. That's more controversial. Some people think that there's other circumstances in which it's fine to kill animals. Apart from those, I think not. Um, So not okay to kill for sport, not okay to kill for your pleasure, not okay to kill for food. But okay to kill if, they're termites and they're going to make your house fall down. Okay to kill them, right? That was why property got in, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, but,
Okay, so um, do you think that the same thing might be true for like stuff like beauty as well? That like there might be some like necessary truths concerning beauty.
yeah, so I suspect that that might be right, but it may be much more contingent. Um, right. I mean, the necessary truths in morality could be necessary truths for creatures like us, and then maybe that makes it a bit more plausible that there'll be necessary truths about beauty for creatures like us. And I think there's a kind of aesthetic sense that we share with quite a range of other creatures. There are lots of animals that like rhythm, and there are lots of animals that like symmetries and so on. And so, you know, it could be true, I think,
Okay,
about aesthetics as well.
right. And so before we wrap this interview up, I just wanted to like ask you a few quick fire questions just to get a little bit like just to hear what you have to say about some things. Okay. So first, and these are going to be a little bit of silly questions. So first, if you could have any superpower, what would it be?
Yeah, I don't know. That's. I'm sorry. This may not go the way that you wanted it to go. Um, so you should always be careful what you wish for, right? And it's not very clear what possessing a superpower would actually mean for you,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I'm not sure that I want any. Is the kind of.
Okay. Um, and so another question would be is which favorite music genre?
Sorry, what's my favorite music genre? Okay, so that's so I would say, I mean, this is really hard to answer. I would say that if somebody else could look at what I listen to, they might say, okay, it's a bit hard to classify this, but I'll call it indie.
Indie. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. And would you rather be a eliminative materialist or a solipsist?
So I think solipsism is a completely crazy position. So I'm not going to go there. Um, I'm not much attracted to limited materialism either, but but yeah, if you're going to force me to choose, I'm going to pick a limited materialism.
Okay. And if you had any movie that you could recommend any of the audience to watch right now, what would it be?
Okay, so this one's an unfortunate question. I haven't seen a movie in about 20 years. I'm just not into movies.
You haven't seen a single movie in 20 years?
Actually, that's not quite true. I've seen two, I think. But I'm not into movies or television either. So like my knowledge of popular culture is very skewed. Like I just am not interested in film. Whereas listen to quite a lot of music.
Okay, fine. Then we'll switch it up a little bit just for you. If you could recommend any book for anyone to read right now, what would it be?
Okay, so the book I've had the most fun reading recently is a book by Jean-Louis Dessau called Why We Talk. It's an amazing book which tries to figure out, to explain why it is that humans evolved the capacity to speak. And I mean, I think he can't be right, but it's a really, really interesting.
Okay.
So he thinks the reason why we learn to talk is essentially political. That humans were starting to live in reasonably large social groups, like bigger than groups of 5 or 10, but maybe groups of 40 or 50 people. And so you get cliques forming. And one of the ways that you can make yourself valuable in one of these cliques is being the first to notice important information. And so being able to talk was a way of being able to draw attention to the fact that you are a valuable member of a clique because you were good at acquiring the information before other people did. And so his story, that's what drove the evolution of human speech. You might think that there are other answers that would be more obvious than that one and more likely to be true, but it's hard to think of a better one. And the kind of important data here is that there are a lot of other early, I mean, we share a common ancestry with creatures that we only diverged from like a kind of 6 or 7 million years ago, chimps and bonobos, and none of them developed anything like the capacity to talk. And you have to be able to explain why they didn't, as well as why humans did. And that makes it seem as though, I mean, especially given the evolutionary bottlenecks that humans went through, that there was something quite specific about the circumstances of our early evolution that led to our capacity to talk. And Searle's hypothesis is not a terrible candidate, even though it doesn't sound right. Anyway, so there's a book. There's a book that I've read recently that I really enjoyed.
That sounds like a wonderful book. Okay, and I guess this will be the last question. If you could pick any philosopher, dead or alive, that would be your favorite philosopher, who would it be?
That one's easy. It would be David Hume.
Why?
Um, so I I really like the dialogues concerning natural religion, and I really like what I know about Hume, the kind of amiable David, as um, he was. That's how Jack Smart used to refer to him. He was clearly Smart's favourite philosopher as well. Um, I think that uh, Hume was genuinely a good person to know. Um, he had lots of friends who didn't share any of his beliefs, but who he was on really good terms with. Right? And so, as a person, unlike many of the famous philosophers, he seems like someone that it would have been good to hang out with.
Well, I guess that wraps up the interview. Thank you so much for joining me today and having this conversation with me. I know it's a little bit early for you, but it was still a wonderful conversation to have.
So it wasn't particularly early for me.
Oh,
It's
okay.
it's it's heading up towards lunchtime now. So
Oh, okay, perfect.
yeah,
Well, thank you anyways. Thank you very much.
yeah. So thanks for inviting me on.